The Winchester rifle felt heavy in Marcus Thompson's weathered hands as he stepped onto his front porch, the morning mist still clinging to the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee. What he saw in the distance made his blood run cold, a line of Cherokee warriors on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun, completely surrounding his isolated ranch. Their painted faces and traditional war dress left no doubt about their intentions. This wasn't a social visit. Just 12 hours earlier, Marcus had made a decision that changed everything. He'd stood between an angry mob and a Cherokee woman named Ayanna, defying his own neighbors to protect someone he'd never met. Now, as he counted at least 30 warriors positioned strategically around his property, he wondered if his active conscience had just signed his death warrant. The lead warrior raised his hand, and the entire line began moving forward in perfect synchronization. Marcus had fought in 3 Indian wars, had seen what Cherokee warriors could do when they set their minds to it. His ranch was a fortress, but it wasn't built to withstand a full tribal assault. Whatever happened next would determine not just his fate, but the future of every settler in the valley. This is the story of how one man's split-second decision to choose courage over comfort, justice over safety, transformed not only his life but the destiny of 2 peoples locked in a conflict that seemed impossible to resolve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble had been brewing in Copper Valley for months before that fateful October evening in 1847. Marcus Thompson had built his ranch on the border between white settlement land and Cherokee territory, a decision that his neighbors had questioned from the very beginning. The land was rich, with clear streams and natural grazing meadows that made it perfect for cattle ranching, but its location made it a lightning rod for the tensions that simmered between the expanding American frontier and the Cherokee Nation. Marcus was not like the other settlers who had come to Tennessee seeking their fortunes. At 35, he was a man shaped by loss and hardened by experience. His wife Sarah and their young son Benjamin had died 3 years earlier during a cholera outbreak that swept through their previous settlement in Kentucky. The grief had nearly destroyed him, turning him from a social man who enjoyed community gatherings into a solitary figure who preferred the company of his cattle and horses to that of people. When he decided to start over in Tennessee, Marcus had deliberately chosen land far from any established towns. He wanted space to heal, room to think, and distance from the well-meaning sympathy of neighbors who didn't understand that some wounds never fully closed. The fact that his chosen property bordered Cherokee land hadn't concerned him initially. In his experience, the Cherokee were generally peaceful people who kept to themselves and honored their agreements. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was how rapidly the political situation would deteriorate. The discovery of gold in Cherokee territory had brought a new wave of prospectors and land speculators to the region, men who saw the native presence as an obstacle to their enrichment, rather than as neighbors with legitimate claims to the land. These newcomers brought with them attitudes and ambitions that clashed violently with the more measured approach that had previously characterized relations between the settlers and the Cherokee. The leader of this new faction was William Crawford, a former military officer who had arrived from Georgia with grand plans for organizing the scattered settlers into what he called a proper territorial government. Crawford was a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that drew followers naturally. He spoke eloquently about manifest destiny, about the God-given right of Americans to claim and civilize the Western territories, and about the necessity of removing what he termed savage obstacles to progress and prosperity. Crawford had established himself in the growing town of Millbrook, about 15 miles from Marcus's ranch, and had quickly gathered around him a core group of supporters who shared his vision of aggressive expansion. These men, mostly young, mostly unmarried, mostly with little to lose and everything to gain from conflict, formed what Crawford called the Copper Valley Protection Association. Officially, the association existed to coordinate defense against Indian raids and to petition the territorial government for greater military protection. Unofficially, it was becoming increasingly clear that Crawford's group was actively working to provoke incidents that would justify military intervention and the forced removal of the Cherokee from their traditional lands. The association held weekly meetings at Morrison's Tavern in Millbrook, gatherings that began as planning sessions but increasingly took on the character of rallies, designed to whip up anti-Cherokee sentiment among the local population. Crawford was a skilled orator who knew how to tap into the fears and prejudices of frontier settlers. He painted vivid pictures of Cherokee raids that might happen, of white women and children who could be threatened, of economic opportunities that were being denied to hardworking American families by the continued presence of savage tribes who didn't understand the proper use of valuable land. Marcus had attended exactly one of these meetings, drawn by curiosity and a sense of civic responsibility. What he witnessed there had disgusted him so thoroughly that he never returned. Crawford and his followers spoke about the Cherokee as if they were dangerous animals rather than human beings with families, traditions, and legitimate claims to the land they had occupied for generations. The casual discussions of violence, the eager planning for confrontations that hadn't yet occurred, the obvious relish with which some of the men contemplated the prospect of bloodshed, all of it had reminded Marcus uncomfortably of the worst aspects of military campaigns he'd participated in during his younger years. After that single meeting, Marcus had made it clear to anyone who asked that he wanted no part of Crawford's association or its activities. This stance had gradually isolated him from much of the local settler community, most of whom had either joined Crawford's group or were too intimidated to speak against it publicly. Marcus didn't particularly care about his social standing, but the isolation meant that he was often unaware of the association's specific plans and activities until after they had already taken place. The Cherokee, for their part, had responded to the increasing tensions with a combination of diplomatic patience and quiet preparation. The local Cherokee community was led by a council of elders headed by Joseph Ridge, a man in his 60s who had spent decades trying to navigate the complex political realities of Cherokee-American relations. Ridge believed firmly in the possibility of peaceful coexistence, but he was also realistic about the challenges they faced. Ridge's approach was to document every incident, every provocation, every violation of existing treaties, and to forward these reports to Cherokee leadership in the eastern part of the territory, as well as to federal authorities who were supposed to enforce treaty obligations. He counseled his people to avoid confrontation, to respond to harassment with dignity rather than violence, and to trust that eventually justice would prevail through proper legal channels. This patient approach was increasingly being questioned by younger Cherokee men who had grown tired of seeing their people insulted and threatened without meaningful response. Led by Joseph Ridge's own son, James Ridge, this faction argued that diplomatic patience was being interpreted as weakness by men like Crawford, and that only a show of strength would command the respect necessary for genuine peace. The tension between these two approaches, diplomatic patience versus defensive strength, was creating divisions within the Cherokee community, just as Crawford's inflammatory rhetoric was polarizing the white settlers. Both communities were being pulled toward extremes by leaders who saw conflict as either inevitable or desirable, while the voices calling for moderation and mutual understanding were being increasingly marginalized. Marcus observed these developments with growing unease, but felt powerless to influence events that seemed to be spiraling beyond any individual's control. His ranch was literally and figuratively on the border between two communities that were being pushed toward war by leaders who seemed more interested in advancing their own agendas than in finding solutions that would allow both peoples to prosper. Specific incident that would draw Marcus directly into the conflict began on a Tuesday morning in early October when Crawford's men accused a young Cherokee woman of stealing livestock from a settler named Robert Hayes. Hayes claimed that 3 of his horses had gone missing during the night, and that he had found what he believed to be Cherokee tracks leading away from his property toward the reservation boundary. The accusation was immediately suspicious to anyone who knew the Cherokee well. Horse theft was considered a serious crime within Cherokee culture, one that would result in severe punishment by the tribal council if proven. For a Cherokee person to steal horses from white settlers would risk not only individual punishment, but also collective retaliation against the entire community. It was exactly the kind of reckless act that Cherokee leaders had been urging their people to avoid. Moreover, Robert Hayes was known to be a heavy drinker whose property management was often chaotic. His horses frequently wandered away because he neglected to maintain his fences properly, and he had a history of making wild accusations when things went wrong on his farm. On 2 previous occasions, horses he had reported stolen had been found grazing peacefully in remote sections of his own land where he had simply forgotten to look for them. But Crawford and his followers were not interested in investigating the facts carefully. They saw the accusation as an opportunity to demonstrate Cherokee perfidy and to justify the kind of strong action they had been advocating for months. Within hours of Hayes making his complaint, Crawford had organized a search party consisting of 12 armed men who set out to find the missing horses and apprehend whoever had taken them. The search party's methods were aggressive and provocative. From the beginning, rather than coordinating with Cherokee authorities or following established procedures for investigating cross-boundary crimes, Crawford's men began conducting their own investigation on Cherokee land without permission. They rode through Cherokee farms and settlements, questioning people in ways that were obviously intended to intimidate rather than gather information. By Wednesday afternoon, the search party had identified Ayanna Blackbird, a 26-year-old Cherokee woman, as their primary suspect. The evidence against her was circumstantial at best. She had been seen in the general area where the horses had allegedly been stolen, and someone claimed to have observed her acting suspiciously near the boundary between Cherokee and settler land. Ayanna was the daughter of Thomas Blackbird, a respected Cherokee craftsman who had built a reputation for the beautiful beadwork and leather goods he produced for trade with both Cherokee and white customers. She was unmarried, which was unusual for a Cherokee woman of her age, but she had chosen to devote herself to learning traditional Cherokee healing practices from her grandmother, one of the community's most respected medicine women. This combination of factors, her unmarried status, her knowledge of traditional practices that white settlers often viewed with suspicion, and her independence from male protection, made Ayanna an ideal target for Crawford's purposes. She represented everything that men like Crawford found threatening about Cherokee culture: traditions they didn't understand, independence they couldn't control, and dignity they couldn't break. On Thursday morning, Crawford's search party announced that they had found definitive evidence of Ayanna's guilt: horse droppings near a secluded grove where she was known to gather medicinal plants. The fact that horses regularly grazed in the area, and that the droppings could have come from any of dozens of animals that used the space, was dismissed as irrelevant. Crawford declared that the evidence was sufficient to warrant immediate arrest and punishment. The Cherokee Council, led by Joseph Ridge, attempted to intervene through proper channels. They pointed out that even if the accusations were true, Cherokee law should govern the punishment of Cherokee citizens, and that existing treaties guaranteed the tribe's right to handle internal justice matters without outside interference. They offered to conduct their own investigation and to provide appropriate compensation if wrongdoing was proven. Crawford rejected these offers contemptuously. He declared that Cherokee justice was insufficient for crimes committed against white settlers, and that allowing the tribe to handle the matter internally would simply encourage future theft. He announced that Ayanna would be arrested by his men and brought to Millbrook for trial under territorial law. regardless of Cherokee objections. When Thomas Blackbird and other Cherokee leaders protested this plan, pointing out that it violated existing treaties and established legal procedures, Crawford's response was to set a deadline. He announced that if Ayanna was not voluntarily surrendered to his custody by Friday evening, he would come and take her by force, using whatever level of violence proved necessary. The ultimatum created exactly the kind of crisis that Crawford had been seeking to provoke. If the Cherokee complied, they would be acknowledging Crawford's authority to override their own legal system and abduct their people at will. If they refused, Crawford would have the pretext he needed to organize a larger armed confrontation that could justify calling for military intervention. Joseph, Ridge and the Cherokee Council found themselves trapped between two unacceptable alternatives. Surrendering Ayanna would establish a precedent that would leave every Cherokee person vulnerable to false accusations and arbitrary arrest. But protecting her would give Crawford the violent incident he was obviously hoping to provoke. As Friday evening approached, tensions in both communities reached a breaking point. Crawford had expanded his original search party into a force of nearly 40 armed men, many of whom had traveled from neighboring settlements to join what they saw as a righteous campaign to impose law and order on an unruly native population. The Cherokee, meanwhile, had quietly organized their own defensive preparations, with young warriors taking positions around the Blackbird family compound and runners carrying messages to Cherokee communities throughout the region. It was into this explosive situation that Marcus Thompson rode on Friday afternoon, completely unaware of the drama that had been unfolding while he'd been focused on the routine business of managing his ranch. He had traveled to Millbrook to purchase supplies and to conduct some banking business, planning to complete his errands and return home before dark. The first sign that something was wrong came when he noticed the unusual number of armed men gathered around Morrison's tavern. The second was the absence of Cherokee traders in the town market, something that happened only during times of serious tension between the communities. When Marcus inquired about the situation, he was quickly brought up to speed on the accusations against Ayanna and Crawford's ultimatum. What he learned filled him with a familiar sense of dread, the same feeling he'd experienced as a young soldier when he'd watched officers make decisions that he knew would lead to unnecessary bloodshed. Marcus finished his business in town as quickly as possible and began the journey back to his ranch, hoping to avoid whatever confrontation was developing. But as he rode through the gathering dusk, he encountered Crawford's expedition heading toward Cherokee territory. 40 men armed with rifles and torches, their faces flushed with liquor and excitement. Crawford spotted Marcus and rode over to greet him with false joviality. "Thompson, perfect timing. We're finally going to solve this Indian problem once and for all. You should join us. Show these savages that white men stick together when it matters." Marcus looked at the assembled men, noting the weapons, the alcohol, the barely controlled aggression that seemed to radiate from the group like heat from a fire. These weren't law enforcement officers conducting a legitimate arrest. This was a lynch mob heading out to commit murder under the pretense of seeking justice. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Marcus asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Crawford's grin revealed his true intentions. "We're going to get that thieving squaw, and we're going to make sure she never steals from decent white folks again. Time to send a message that will keep the rest of them in line." In that moment, Marcus Thompson faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could turn away, ride home to his ranch, and let events unfold without his participation. It would be the safe choice, the prudent choice, the choice that would keep him out of trouble with his neighbors and allow him to maintain the quiet, isolated existence he had built for himself. Or he could follow his conscience into a confrontation that would change everything. Marcus thought about his wife Sarah, about the values she had tried to instill in their son Benjamin, about the kind of man he had promised to be when he married her. He thought about the Cherokee families he had met during his 3 years in the valley, People who had shown him nothing but courtesy and respect, despite his status as an outsider on their traditional lands. Most of all, he thought about a young Cherokee woman he had never met, who was about to become the victim of mob violence simply because men like Crawford needed someone to blame for their own failures and frustrations. The choice, when it came down to it, was not really a choice at all. Marcus Thompson turned his horse toward Cherokee territory and began riding hard through the darkness, racing against time to reach Ayanna Blackbird before Crawford's mob could find her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus's horse thundered through the narrow forest trails that connected settler territory to Cherokee lands, branches whipping against his face as he pushed the animal harder than he ever had before. Behind him, he could hear the distant sounds of Crawford's mob, 40 drunken men with torches and rifles, moving more slowly but with deadly purpose through the same woods. The Cherokee settlement where Ayanna lived was still 3 miles away, and Marcus wasn't even certain he was taking the fastest route. He had visited Cherokee territory only a handful of times during his 3 years in the valley, always for legitimate trade business and always during daylight hours. Now racing through unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness, he was navigating by instinct and desperate hope. His mare, Belle, was a strong animal built for ranch work rather than speed, but she seemed to sense the urgency of their mission. Her hooves found purchase on rocky slopes and muddy creek crossings that would have challenged them in broad daylight. Marcus leaned low over her neck, whispering encouragement while his mind raced through the limited options available to him. Even if he reached Ayanna before Crawford's mob, what then? He was one man with a rifle and a pistol, facing 40 armed settlers who believed they were on a righteous mission to punish a horse thief. Direct confrontation would be suicide, and would likely result in Ayanna's death anyway. He needed a plan that went beyond simply arriving first. As he rode, Marcus found himself thinking about the Cherokee people he had encountered during his time in the valley. There was Samuel Ridge, Joseph's younger brother, who had helped him track down stolen cattle the previous spring. Samuel had demonstrated a knowledge of animal behavior and tracking skills that far exceeded anything Marcus had learned in his years of ranching. More importantly, he had refused any payment for his assistance, saying simply that neighbors should help neighbors without expectation of reward. There was also Mary Thornton, a Cherokee woman who had appeared at his ranch during a severe thunderstorm the previous winter, seeking shelter for herself and her 2 young children. Marcus had provided food and warmth for the night, and in return, Mary had shared knowledge about local plants that could be used to treat sick cattle. Her remedies had saved 3 of his best breeding cows from a respiratory infection that conventional treatments had failed to address. These interactions had gradually shifted Marcus's understanding of his Cherokee neighbors from the abstract concept of Indians that dominated settler conversations to recognition of them as individuals with names, families, skills, and dignity. It was one thing to listen to Crawford's inflammatory speeches about savage threats to civilization. It was quite another to contemplate the murder of people who had shown him nothing but kindness and respect. The sound of Crawford's mob was getting closer, their torches creating an eerie glow through the trees behind him. Marcus urged Belle forward, knowing that every minute of delay brought them closer to a confrontation that could only end in tragedy. As he crested a ridge that overlooked the Cherokee settlement, Marcus could see the layout of the community spread out in the valley below. Unlike the scattered individual homesteads that characterized white settlement patterns, the Cherokee had built their homes in a deliberate arrangement that emphasized community connection while respecting family privacy. Gardens and workshops were positioned to take advantage of natural water sources and sunlight, creating an overall impression of harmony between human activity and the natural landscape. Even in the darkness, Marcus could see signs that the Cherokee were aware of the approaching threat. No light showed in any of the windows, but he could detect subtle movements that suggested people were awake and alert. The community's dogs, normally vocal about strangers approaching, were completely silent, a clear indication that they had been deliberately quieted to avoid revealing defensive positions. Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of riding directly to the Blackbird family compound where Ayanna was likely hiding, he dismounted at the edge of the settlement and approached on foot, calling out softly in the direction of the nearest building. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I live at the ranch on Copper Creek. I've come to warn you about Crawford's men. They're maybe 10 minutes behind me, and they're not coming to make an arrest. They're coming to commit murder." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the shadows between two buildings, a Cherokee man Marcus recognized as Samuel Ridge. Samuel approached cautiously, his own rifle held ready but not directly threatening. "Marcus Thompson," Samuel said quietly. "I know who you are. Why are you here? Why risk yourself for our troubles?" "Because 40 armed men riding through the night with torches and liquor aren't coming to serve justice," Marcus replied. "They're coming to kill someone, and probably anyone who gets in their way. That's not justice, that's murder." Samuel studied Marcus's face in the dim starlight, apparently trying to assess the sincerity of his warning. "You could have stayed home, pretended not to know what Crawford was planning. Safer for you. Maybe, but I've seen what mobs like this do when they get worked up. I fought in enough military actions to know the difference between legitimate law enforcement and bloodthirsty. Revenge. This is revenge, nothing more." Before Samuel could respond, another figure approached from the shadows, an older Cherokee man whom Marcus recognized as Joseph Ridge, the community's primary leader. Ridge moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Mr. Thompson," Ridge said formally, "Samuel tells me you've brought warning of Crawford's approach. We are grateful for this information, but I must ask, what do you propose we do with it?" The question forced Marcus to confront the limitations of his impulsive decision to race ahead of the mob. Warning the Cherokee was one thing, but actually preventing the violence Crawford intended was quite another matter entirely. "Where is Ayanna Blackbird now?" Marcus asked. Ridge hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to trust a white settler with information that could endanger one of his people. Samuel placed a hand on his uncle's arm and nodded slightly, apparently vouching for Marcus's reliability, based on their previous interactions. "She is in this sacred grove, 2 miles north of here," Ridge said finally. "My daughter Mary is with her, along with 3 of our young warriors. They are prepared to defend her, but against 40 armed men." He shrugged grimly. Marcus felt his heart sink. 3 Cherokee warriors, no matter how skilled, would not be able to protect Ayanna against Crawford's mob. They would die bravely, but they would still die, and their deaths would provide Crawford with exactly the kind of incident he needed to justify calling for military intervention against the entire Key community. "There might be another way," Marcus said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "Crawford's men are expecting to find Ayanna in the settlement. They're planning to search the buildings, probably burn a few to make their point. What if she wasn't here? What if someone else was found with the missing horses instead?" Ridge and Samuel exchanged glances, both clearly uncertain where Marcus was heading with this line of thinking. "You're talking about producing Hayes's missing horses?" Samuel asked. "Even if we could find them, Crawford isn't really interested in recovering stolen property. He wants blood. Maybe, but if the horses were found on my property, along with evidence that someone else entirely had taken them, someone who isn't Cherokee, Crawford would lose his justification for being on Cherokee land at all. The plan Marcus was proposing was dangerous and far from certain, but it had the advantage of potentially diffusing the immediate crisis without requiring a direct military confrontation. If he could convince Crawford's mob that the horse theft had been committed by someone other than a Cherokee person, the excuse for their raid would evaporate. "You're talking about framing an innocent person," Ridge pointed out. "No," Marcus replied. "I'm talking about exposing the truth. I know Robert Hayes, and I know his property management. I'll bet those horses are wandering around loose somewhere. On his own land, just like the last 2 times he reported them stolen. If I can find them and get them back to his property before Crawford's mob returns, it will make his accusation against Ayanna look exactly like what it is, a drunken mistake by a careless man who lost track of his own livestock." Samuel's expression shifted as he began to understand the potential of Marcus's proposal. And if Crawford finds no stolen horses on Cherokee land, and discovers that the missing animals have been safely returned to Hayes's property, then his entire justification for this raid disappears, Marcus finished. It becomes impossible for him to claim that Cherokee horse thieves represent a threat that requires violent suppression. Ridge remained skeptical. This plan requires finding Hayes's horses, moving them back to his property, and making it appear that they were never actually stolen, all while Crawford's mob is conducting their search here. The timing would have to be perfect, and it requires Crawford's men to actually leave when they don't find what they're looking for, Samuel added. Men who have come this far, worked themselves up to this level of anger, they might decide to create the incident they want, even if they can't find the excuse they expected. Marcus nodded grimly. Both men were right about the risks and uncertainties involved. But as the sound of approaching horses grew louder in the distance, alternatives were rapidly disappearing. "I know where Hayes usually lets his horses graze when they wander off," Marcus said. "There's a meadow about 2 miles south of his main property where the grass stays green longer than anywhere else in the area. If those horses are anywhere, they'll be there. I can reach that meadow, round up the animals, and get them back to Hayes's property in maybe an hour. And while you're doing that, Crawford's mob will be here, searching for Ayanna," Ridge observed. "Which is why she needs to not be here," Marcus replied. "Can your people move her further away, somewhere Crawford's men won't think to look?" Ridge was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks of Marcus's proposal against the certainty of violence if Crawford's mob found Ayanna. Finally, he nodded slowly. "There is a place. An old hunting lodge in the mountains, maybe 6 miles from here. Crawford's men wouldn't know about it, and it's too far for them to search tonight. Then we have a chance," Marcus said. "But we need to move now, before Crawford gets here." What followed was a carefully coordinated effort that required split-second timing and complete trust between people who barely knew each other. Samuel Ridge volunteered to ride to the sacred grove and escort Ayanna and her protectors to the mountain hunting lodge, using trails that would keep them well away from Crawford's approach route. Meanwhile, Joseph Ridge would remain in the settlement to deal with Crawford's mob when they arrived, using diplomatic delaying tactics to buy Marcus time to locate and relocate the missing horses. Marcus mounted Bell and rode hard toward the meadow where he hoped to find Hayes's missing animals. The plan was risky and dependent on numerous factors beyond his control, but it was the only alternative to a confrontation that would inevitably result in bloodshed. As he rode through the darkness, Marcus found himself thinking about the choice he had made and its potential consequences. By the time the sun rose, he would either have helped prevent a massacre, or he would have made himself an enemy of every white settler in the valley. There would be no middle ground, no way to claim neutrality in what was rapidly becoming an open conflict between 2 communities. The thought should have terrified him, but instead Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since Sarah and Benjamin's deaths, he was acting according to his deepest convictions, rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond his control. Whatever happened next, he would face it knowing that he had chosen to stand for justice rather than safety, for truth rather than convenience. behind him, the glow of Crawford's torches was growing brighter as the mob approached the Cherokee settlement. Ahead of him lay the meadow where Hayes's horses might or might not be grazing peacefully, unaware that their whereabouts had become the excuse for potential genocide. Between those 2 points lay the difference between peace and war, between justice and massacre, between the man Marcus Thompson had been and the man he was choosing to become. The meadow lay bathed in pale moonlight, and Marcus's heart leaped when he spotted the familiar silhouettes of 3 horses grazing peacefully near the far tree line. Hayes's missing animals were exactly where Marcus had predicted they would be, on a section of open grassland that technically belonged to Hayes himself, but was so far from his main property that he had apparently forgotten to search there. Marcus approached the horses slowly, speaking in the low, calm tones that Bell had taught him were most effective with skittish animals. These were Hayes's workhorses, sturdy animals bred for farm labor rather than speed, and they showed no signs of distress or mistreatment. Their presence here confirmed what Marcus had suspected from the beginning. This was not a case of theft, but simply poor animal management by a man who had too many other problems to keep proper track of his livestock. Getting the horses moving toward Hayes's property proved easier than Marcus had expected. The animals were familiar with him from previous encounters, and they followed Bell willingly as he led them through the forest trails that connected the meadow to Hayes's farm. The real challenge would be getting them back onto Hayes's property and making their presence there obvious enough that Crawford's returning mob couldn't miss them, all while maintaining the fiction that they had never actually been missing. As Marcus guided the horses through the darkness, he could hear distant sounds from the direction of the Cherokee settlement, shouting voices, the crack of breaking wood, the occasional gunshot fired into the air. Crawford's mob had arrived and was conducting their search with the subtle restraint Marcus had expected from 40 drunk men with torches and weapons. The sounds made Marcus sick with worry about what was happening to Joseph Ridge and the other Cherokee who had remained behind to face Crawford's wrath. The plan had called for Ridge to use diplomatic stalling tactics, but there were limits to how long even the most skilled negotiator could delay a mob that was determined to find someone to blame for their grievances. Marcus reached Hayes's property just as the eastern horizon was beginning to show the first faint traces of dawn. Hayes's farmhouse was dark, which meant the man was either passed out drunk or had wisely decided to make himself scarce while his accusations played out. Marcus quietly guided the 3 horses into Hayes's main pasture, then broke down a section of fence to make it appear that the animals had wandered back on their own after breaking through a weak spot in the property boundary. The deception wasn't perfect, but it would be convincing enough to raise serious questions about the original theft accusation, especially since the horses showed no signs of having been ridden hard or mistreated. Any objective observer would conclude that these animals had simply wandered away from a poorly maintained farm and had eventually found their way back on their own, with the horses safely positioned where Crawford's men couldn't fail to notice them. Marcus faced his next challenge, getting back to the Cherokee settlement before the mob departed. If Crawford's men left Cherokee territory without finding any evidence of horse theft, and then discovered the missing animals peacefully grazing on Hayes's own property, it would be difficult for even Crawford to maintain his claims about Cherokee criminality. But the plan's success depended on timing, and Marcus was rapidly running out of time. The sky was growing lighter by the minute, and Crawford's mob would not want to be caught on Cherokee land in broad daylight, where their activities might be observed and reported to territorial authorities. Marcus pushed Bell harder than ever before as they raced back toward the Cherokee settlement, following a more direct route that took them through rougher terrain but cut nearly a mile off the distance. As they climbed the ridge that overlooked the Cherokee community, Marcus could see that Crawford's search was still in progress, but the mob's behavior had shifted from systematic investigation to increasingly frustrated destruction. Several Cherokee buildings showed signs of damage: broken windows, kicked-in doors, the smoldering remains of what had once been a storage shed. But there were no signs of serious violence, which suggested that Joseph Ridge's diplomatic efforts had been at least partially successful in preventing the worst-case scenario. Marcus could see Crawford himself standing in the center of the settlement, gesturing angrily as he gave orders to his followers. Even at a distance, Crawford's body language conveyed barely controlled rage at his failure to find the evidence he had expected. The mob was on the verge of either giving up their search or escalating to outright violence against the Cherokee community. This was the moment when Marcus Thompson made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of waiting to see how the situation developed, he rode directly into the Cherokee settlement, approaching Crawford's mob with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from knowing you hold the winning cards. "Crawford," Marcus called out as he dismounted near the center of the settlement. "What the hell are you doing here?" Crawford spun around, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Thompson, what are you doing on Indian land? Don't tell me you're sympathizing with these horse thieves." "Horse thieves?" Marcus replied, allowing genuine confusion to color his voice. "What are you talking about? Hayes's horses came back on their own yesterday evening. I saw them in his pasture when I rode past his place this morning." The effect of Marcus's words on Crawford's mob was immediate and dramatic. Men who had been worked up to a fever pitch of righteous anger suddenly found themselves confronted with information that undermined the entire justification for their presence on Cherokee land. "That's impossible," Crawford snarled. "Hayes reported those horses stolen 3 days ago. We have witnesses who saw Indian tracks leading away from his property." "Then your witnesses need to get their eyes checked," Marcus replied calmly. "Those horses are grazing peacefully in Hayes's own pasture right now. Looks like they broke through a weak section of fence and wandered off, then found their way back home like horses usually do." Several of Crawford's followers began exchanging uncertain glances. These were men who knew horses and understood that livestock frequently wandered away from poorly maintained properties. The scenario Marcus was describing was far more plausible than the elaborate theft conspiracy Crawford had been promoting. Joseph Ridge, who had been standing silently under guard during Crawford's search, stepped forward with careful dignity. "Mr. Crawford, as I attempted to explain earlier, horse theft is a serious crime under Cherokee law. If any of our people had taken Mr. Hayes's animals, they would have been subject to immediate punishment by our tribal council. We do not tolerate such behavior any more than you do." Crawford's face was growing redder by the minute as he realized that his carefully orchestrated raid was collapsing around him. "I don't believe it," he declared. "Thompson, you're lying to protect these savages. There's no way those horses just wandered home on their own." "Then let's go check," Marcus suggested mildly. "Hayes's farm is only 4 miles from here. We can ride over there right now and see for ourselves whether the missing horses are in his pasture or not." The suggestion put Crawford in an impossible position. If he agreed to check on the horses and found them safely returned to Hayes's property, his entire case against the Cherokee would collapse publicly. If he refused to investigate, it would look like he was more interested in attacking Cherokee people than in recovering stolen property. Several of Crawford's followers were already murmuring among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. These were men who had signed up for what they believed would be a justified mission to punish horse thieves, not for an unprovoked attack on innocent people. "This is a trick," Crawford declared, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Thompson's working with them somehow. This whole thing is a setup." "A setup?" Marcus laughed, allowing genuine amusement to show in his voice. "Crawford, you're the one who organized 40 men to ride through the night chasing horses that were never actually stolen. If anyone's being set up here, it's you, by your own poor judgment and Robert Hayes's worse memory." The laughter of Marcus's response was perfectly calculated to deflate the remaining tension in Crawford's mob. Men who had been ready for a righteous battle against horse Thieves were not prepared for the possibility that they had been made to look foolish by a drunk farmer who couldn't keep track of his own livestock. Samuel Ridge appeared from behind one of the damaged buildings, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had been watching the confrontation develop. "Mr. Crawford," he said respectfully, "my uncle has offered to provide compensation for any actual damages your people may have suffered, but it appears that no damages have occurred. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if your men returned to your homes while the situation can still be resolved peacefully." The suggestion was diplomatically phrased, but it carried an underlying message that was impossible to miss. The Cherokee had been patient with Crawford's raid, but their patience was not unlimited. If Crawford's men chose to continue their aggressive behavior, now that their original justification had evaporated, they would be crossing a line from misguided law enforcement into outright criminal assault. Crawford looked around at his followers, clearly trying to assess how much support remained for continuing the confrontation. What he saw was not encouraging. Most of his men were already moving toward their horses, eager to distance themselves from what was obviously becoming an embarrassing mistake. "This isn't over," Crawford declared, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. "There's still the question of where that Blackbird woman has been hiding. If she's innocent, why did she run? If 40 armed men were coming to your house in the middle of the night, wouldn't you hide too?" Marcus asked reasonably. "Seems like a pretty normal reaction to an abnormal situation." Joseph Ridge stepped forward again. "Mr. Crawford, Ayanna Blackbird is a respected member of our community who has never been accused of any wrongdoing before this incident. She withdrew from the settlement when your men arrived because she feared for her safety, not because she was guilty of any crime. This is the natural response of any person faced with mob violence." The word mob hung in the air like an accusation, forcing Crawford's followers to confront the reality of what they had become. These were men who thought of themselves as law-abiding citizens, not as participants in vigilante violence. The recognition that their actions could be accurately described as mob violence was profoundly unsettling. Crawford made one final attempt to salvage his authority. "Fine," he snarled. "We'll go check on Hayes's horses. But if they're not there, if this turns out to be some kind of elaborate Cherokee trick, there will be consequences." "Fair enough," Marcus agreed. "And if the horses are exactly where I said they are, grazing peacefully in Hayes's own pasture, then I expect you'll owe these people an apology for the damage you've done to their property tonight." The ride to Hayes's farm took place in tense silence, with Crawford's diminished mob now reduced to perhaps 20 men, as the rest had quietly departed during the confrontation, following Marcus and several Cherokee representatives to verify the status of the allegedly stolen horses. What they found was exactly what Marcus had predicted: 3 horses grazing contentedly in Hayes's pasture, next to a section of broken fence that clearly showed how the animals had wandered away from the property and eventually returned on their own. Hayes himself was nowhere to be found, having apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor when it came to facing the consequences of his false accusation. His absence only reinforced the impression that the entire horse theft story had been the product of a drunk man's poor memory rather than any actual criminal activity. Crawford stared at the horses in furious silence, clearly struggling to accept the collapse of his carefully constructed justification for attacking the Cherokee community. Several of his remaining followers were already turning their horses toward home, eager to distance themselves from what had become an obvious mistake. "Looks like your horse thieves were actually just horses," Marcus observed mildly. "Amazing how that works sometimes." Joseph Ridge, who had maintained his diplomatic composure throughout the entire ordeal, addressed Crawford directly. "Mr. Crawford, our people have shown considerable patience with tonight's events. We understand that mistakes can happen and that good intentions can sometimes lead to unfortunate results. We are prepared to put this incident behind us, provided that there is no repetition of such behavior in the future. The offer of peaceful resolution was more generous than Crawford deserved, and everyone present knew it. The Cherokee had been subjected to an unprovoked attack based on false accusations, had their property damaged, and had been threatened with violence, yet they were still offering to resolve the situation without demanding punishment or compensation. Crawford's response revealed the depth of his character, or rather, the lack thereof. Instead of accepting responsibility for his mistakes and apologizing for the harm he had caused, he chose to retreat into wounded pride and resentful threats. "This isn't finished," he declared as he wheeled his horse toward town. "You people think you're so smart, but this valley isn't big enough for both our communities. Sooner or later, there's going to be a reckoning." With that parting threat, Crawford rode away, followed by the remnants of his mob. The immediate crisis was over, but the underlying tensions that had created it remained unresolved. As the sun rose fully over the Tennessee hills, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in Hayes's pasture alongside Joseph and Samuel Ridge, watching Crawford's retreating figures disappear into the morning mist. The night's events had prevented a massacre, but they had also drawn clear battle lines for a larger conflict that was still to come. "Thank you," Joseph Ridge said simply, extending his hand to Marcus. "What you did tonight saved lives, Cherokee. Lives, and probably the lives of some of Crawford's men as well. Violence would have served no one's interests." Marcus accepted the handshake, understanding that it represented more than just gratitude for a single night's actions. It was an offer of alliance, of mutual respect between communities that had chosen to trust each other, despite the forces working to drive them apart. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, looking toward the Cherokee settlement where smoke was still rising from the buildings Crawford's men had damaged. Samuel Ridge followed his gaze thoughtfully. "Now we rebuild what was damaged, and we prepare for whatever comes next. Crawford's threat was not idle. He will try again, probably with greater force and better planning. And when he does," Marcus said quietly, "he won't find the Cherokee community facing him alone." The promise was made without hesitation and accepted with the gravity it deserved. Whatever the future held for Copper Valley, the events of that October night had created bonds that would not easily be broken. 3 days after Crawford's failed raid, Marcus was mending fence on the southern boundary of his property when he heard the soft sound of someone approaching through the forest. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle that now never left his side, but he relaxed when he recognized the measured footsteps of someone moving with deliberate care rather than hostile intent. The woman who emerged from the tree line was unlike anyone Marcus had ever encountered. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed to make no sound on the forest floor, her long black hair braided with small silver ornaments that caught the afternoon sunlight. Her dress was traditional Cherokee work, beautifully crafted from soft deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns that seemed to tell stories Marcus couldn't read, but it was her eyes that stopped him completely. They were dark and intelligent, holding depths of knowledge and experience that seemed impossible in someone who appeared to be no more than 26 years old. When she looked at him, Marcus felt as if she were seeing not just his physical appearance, but something deeper, his character, his intentions, perhaps even his soul. "You are Marcus Thompson," she said, and her voice carried the same quiet authority as her presence. It wasn't a question but a statement of recognition, as if she had been expecting this meeting. "I am," Marcus replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "and you must be Ayanna Blackbird." She nodded slightly, studying his face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "I have come to thank you for what you did 3 nights ago. Your actions saved my life, and probably the lives of several of my people as well." "No thanks necessary," Marcus said. "Any decent person would have done the same thing." Ayanna's slight smile suggested she disagreed with that assessment. Perhaps. But not every person would have risked their standing with their own community to protect someone they had never met. That requires a different kind of courage. She moved closer, and Marcus caught the scent of medicinal herbs and wood smoke that seemed to cling to her clothing. Everything about her spoke of someone deeply connected to the natural world, someone who understood secrets that remained hidden from most people. "My grandmother wishes to meet you," Ayanna continued. "She is our community's medicine woman, and she believes that our paths crossing was not accidental. She says the spirits have been speaking to her about changes coming to this valley, and about the role you may play in those changes." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "I'm not sure I believe in spirits or prophecy, Miss Blackbird. I'm just a rancher trying to live peacefully and mind my own business." "And yet you chose not to mind your own business when Crawford's mob was riding toward our settlement," Ayanna observed. "Something moved you to action that night. Call it conscience, call it spirit guidance. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that you listened to whatever voice told you to intervene." The conversation was taking a direction that made Marcus uncomfortable, not because he disbelieved what Ayanna was saying, but because it forced him to confront the possibility that his decision to help the Cherokee had been about more than simple human decency. There had been something almost inevitable about his choice that night, as if he had been pulled toward the Cherokee settlement by forces beyond his conscious control. "Your grandmother," Marcus said, changing the subject. "She's the one who trained you in the healing arts?" Ayanna nodded. "Among other things. Cherokee medicine involves more than just treating physical ailments. We learn to see the connections between all living things, to understand how spiritual imbalance can manifest as physical illness, to work with natural forces rather than against them." As she spoke, Ayanna moved toward a section of Marcus's fence, where several of his cattle were gathered. The animals, normally skittish around strangers, approached her without fear. She placed her hands on the neck of his prize bull, a normally aggressive animal that had never tolerated human contact beyond what was absolutely necessary. Under Ayanna's touch, the bull became completely calm, almost docile. She examined the animal with practiced skill, her hands moving over his body in patterns that reminded Marcus of the way Dr. Porter examined his human patients. "This one has been favoring his right front leg," she observed. "Not seriously injured, but there's inflammation in the joint that will become worse if not treated." Marcus stared at her in amazement. He had indeed noticed that the bull was moving slightly differently, but he had attributed it to normal aging rather than any specific injury. The fact that Ayanna could diagnose the problem after just a few moments of contact was remarkable. "Can you help him?" Marcus asked. Instead of answering directly, Ayanna moved her hands to the bull's shoulder and began working with a combination of pressure and movement that was unlike anything Marcus had seen before. She wasn't just massaging the muscles. She seemed to be manipulating something deeper, working with energy flows that were invisible but apparently very real. After about 10 minutes of this treatment, she stepped back. The bull shook himself vigorously, then took several experimental steps. The slight limp that had been developing was completely gone. "How did you do that?" Marcus asked in wonder. "Everything is connected," Ayanna replied simply. "The injury was caused by compensation for an old wound that never healed properly. By releasing the tension in his shoulder, I allowed his body to find its natural balance again." She moved to another animal, a young cow that had been thin and listless despite adequate feed. Again, her hands seemed to find problems that weren't visible to Marcus's eyes, and again her treatment produced immediate and dramatic results. "Where did you learn to do this?" Marcus asked as they watched the cow rejoin the herd with obvious renewed energy. "From my grandmother, as she learned from her grandmother before her, but also from the animals themselves, from the plants, from the land. Cherokee medicine teaches us to listen to all the voices of creation, not just the human ones." As the afternoon progressed, Ayanna examined several more of Marcus's animals, treating minor ailments and imbalances with techniques that were completely outside his experience, but undeniably effective. More importantly, she began to share insights about the deeper connections between land management, animal health, and spiritual harmony that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about ranching. "Your cattle are healthy," she observed as they walked through his pastures, "but they could be thriving instead of just surviving. The land wants to support more life than you're currently asking of it." "I don't understand," Marcus said. "I rotate my grazing. I maintain the water sources. I provide supplemental feed when necessary. What more could I be doing?" Ayanna knelt beside a small stream that ran through the middle of his property, cupping the water in her hands and tasting it thoughtfully. "The water is clean, but it's not alive. Upstream, where the forest is thicker, the water dances over rocks and through root systems that add minerals and energy. Here, where the channel has been straightened for convenience, the water moves too quickly to absorb what the land wants to give it." She stood and pointed toward a section of pasture that Marcus had always considered his most productive. "This area produces good grass because the soil is rich, but it could produce twice as much if you worked with the natural drainage patterns instead of against them. Small changes in how water moves across the land could transform everything." 4. The next hour, Ayanna walked Marcus through his own property, showing him details he had never noticed despite 3 years of daily observation. She pointed out subtle signs of soil erosion, identified plants that indicated mineral deficiencies, and explained how different animals could work together to improve land health rather than simply consuming resources. "You see your ranch as separate pieces," she explained. "Cattle here, horses there, crops in another section. But everything is part of one living system. When you understand the connections, you can work with them instead of constantly fighting against them." As they talked, Marcus found himself drawn not just to Ayanna's knowledge, but to her way of seeing the world, where he had learned to view his land as property to be managed and controlled. She saw it as a community of living beings that could thrive together if their relationships were properly understood. "Your grandmother," Marcus said as the sun began to set. "When does she want to meet with me?" "Tomorrow evening, if you're willing. But I should warn you, she will ask difficult questions about your intentions and your willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of your choices." "What consequences?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Crawford's attack on our settlement was just the beginning," Ayanna said seriously. "He represents forces that want to remove Cherokee people from this land entirely, by violence if necessary. By helping us, by publicly choosing our side, you've made yourself an enemy of those forces." Marcus had been thinking about this very issue for the past 3 days, weighing the implications of his decision to confront Crawford's mob. "Are you suggesting I should regret helping your people?" "Not at all. I'm suggesting that you understand what your help may cost you. Crawford has influence with territorial authorities, with military commanders, with business interests that profit from conflict between Cherokee and white communities. He will use that influence to make your life as difficult as possible. Let him try," Marcus said grimly. "I've faced worse enemies than William Crawford." Ayanna studied his face in the fading light, apparently satisfied by what she saw there. "My grandmother said you would say something like that. She also said to tell you that courage alone won't be enough for what's coming. You'll need allies, knowledge and skills that you don't currently possess." "What kind of skills?" "The kind that allow someone to survive when powerful forces are working to destroy them. The kind that help communities defend themselves without becoming the aggressors. The kind that build bridges between peoples who have been taught to see each other as enemies." As Ayanna prepared to leave, she paused and placed her hand briefly on Marcus's arm. The contact sent a warmth through him that was different from anything he had experienced since Sarah's death. Not romantic attraction, exactly, but recognition of a deep spiritual connection that transcended ordinary human relationships. "There is something else my grandmother wanted me to tell you," she said softly. "She says your wife is pleased that you have found your courage again. She says Sarah knows you are honoring her memory by protecting others who cannot protect themselves." Marcus felt his breath catch. How could your grandmother possibly know about Sarah? "The spirit world is not separate from this world," Ayanna replied. "Those who have passed on remain connected to those they loved. Sometimes when the need is great enough, they find ways to communicate through those who know how to listen." With that, she melted back into the forest as silently as she had appeared, leaving Marcus standing alone in his pasture with his mind reeling from everything he had witnessed and learned that night, as he sat by his fireplace trying to process the day's events. Marcus found himself thinking about the changes that had begun to transform his carefully ordered existence. 3 days ago, he had been a solitary rancher concerned only with his own survival and prosperity. Now he was apparently an ally of the Cherokee Nation, a target of William Crawford's hostility, and someone whose actions were being guided by spiritual forces he didn't fully understand. The transformation should have terrified him, but instead, Marcus felt more alive than he had since Sarah's death. For the first time in 3 years, he was part of something larger than his own grief, connected to people and purposes that gave meaning to his daily existence. Tomorrow he would meet with Ayanna's grandmother and learn what role he was expected to play in the larger drama unfolding in Copper Valley. Tonight, he would prepare himself for whatever challenges that role might bring. As he banked the fire and prepared for bed, Marcus caught himself listening to the night sounds outside his cabin with new attention. The calls of owls, the rustling of wind through the trees, the distant sound of his cattle settling for the night. All of it seemed part of a larger conversation that he was only beginning to understand. Change was coming to Copper Valley, and Marcus Thompson was going to be at the center of it. The question was whether he would prove worthy of the trust that Ayanna and her people were placing in him. The sacred grove where Marcus met Ayanna's grandmother lay hidden deep within Cherokee territory, accessible only by a winding trail that seemed to disappear and reappear among ancient oak trees whose massive trunks spoke of centuries of growth. As Ayanna led him through the forest in the gathering dusk, Marcus felt as if he were entering a world where different laws applied, where the ordinary rules of frontier life gave way to older, deeper truths. The grandmother, who introduced herself simply as Atsila, was unlike any woman Marcus had ever encountered. Though she appeared to be in her 70s, her movements possessed a fluid grace that suggested strength far beyond her apparent age. Her silver hair was braided with feathers and small carved bones, and her dark eyes held depths of wisdom that seemed to see straight through to his soul. She sat on a woven mat beside a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows across her weathered face as she studied Marcus with an intensity that was both disconcerting and strangely comforting. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. "Marcus Thompson," she said in English that carried only the faintest trace of Cherokee accent, "you have chosen a difficult path. You understand what that choice will cost you." "I'm beginning to," Marcus replied honestly. "But I'd rather face difficulties for doing what's right than live peacefully by doing what's wrong." Atsila nodded approvingly. "Good. Peace built on injustice is no peace at all. It's simply delayed conflict. The spirits have been showing me visions of what's coming to this valley, and your role in those events is central to whether we find true peace or descend into war." She gestured for Marcus to sit across from her, then began preparing something in a small clay bowl, a mixture of herbs and powders that filled the air with a scent both medicinal and mystical. "Tell me about the night your wife died," she said suddenly. The unexpected question hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I don't see how that's relevant to—" "Everything is relevant," Atsila interrupted gently but firmly. "The spirits do not move us toward actions without preparing us through experience. Your loss, your grief, your healing, all of it has been shaping you for what's coming. Marcus found himself speaking about Sarah's death for the first time since he'd left Kentucky. He told Atsila about the fever that had swept through their settlement, about watching his wife waste away despite every effort to save her, about the terrible helplessness of being unable to protect the person he loved most in the world. And, "Your son?" Atsila asked quietly when he finished describing Sarah's final hours. "Benjamin died 3 days later," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was only 7. The fever took him so quickly that we barely had time to say goodbye." Atsila was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if reading messages in the flames. "You blame yourself for their deaths," she said finally. "You believe that a stronger man, a better man, would have found a way to save them." Marcus felt tears he hadn't shed in years threatening to spill over. "I should have gotten them to a doctor sooner. I should have taken them away from the settlement when the fever first appeared. You should have been God instead of human," Atsila finished for him. "That is the burden you have been carrying, the impossible weight of trying to control forces beyond any mortal's power." She leaned forward and placed her weathered hand over his. "Your wife and son died because disease is part of the natural world, not because you failed them. The spirits of the departed do not blame the living for being unable to prevent death. They only ask that we honor their memory by continuing to live with purpose and love." The words released something in Marcus that had been locked away since the day he'd buried his family. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to grieve fully, to feel the depth of his loss without the additional burden of self-blame that had made his pain unbearable. When his tears finally subsided, Atsila offered him a cup of the herbal mixture she had been preparing. "Drink this," she said. "It will help you see more clearly what the spirits want to show you." Marcus hesitated, uncertain about consuming an unknown Cherokee potion, but something in Atsila's manner convinced him to trust her. The liquid was bitter, but not unpleasant, with a warming quality that seemed to spread through his entire body. Within minutes, the world around him began to shift and change. The fire's flames seemed to tell stories, showing him images of events, past and future. He saw the Cherokee village as it had existed before white settlement, a thriving community living in harmony with the natural world. He saw the gradual encroachment of settlers, the misunderstandings and conflicts that had led to the current crisis, but most powerfully, he saw visions of what could happen in the months ahead. In one vision, Crawford's hatred led to open warfare between the two communities, with innocent people on both sides, dying in a conflict that served no one's interests. In another, he saw himself working alongside Cherokee leaders to build bridges of understanding that allowed both peoples to thrive. In the same valley, "You see the choices," Atsila said, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "The spirits are not puppeteers who control human destiny, but they can show us the paths available to us and the consequences of our decisions." In the visions, Marcus saw Ayana's role as well. She was meant to be more than just someone he had helped. She was destined to become a teacher who could bridge the gap between Cherokee and white approaches to healing and living. But for her to fulfill that destiny, she needed protection and support from someone who could navigate both worlds. "Why me?" Marcus asked as the visions began to fade. "I'm just a rancher. I don't have political influence or military connections. What can I possibly do to change the course of events?" "Sometimes the most powerful actions come from the most unexpected sources," Atsila replied. "You have something that men like Crawford lack, the ability to see other people as human beings, rather than obstacles to your ambitions. That quality, combined with your courage and your need to find purpose after loss, makes you uniquely suited for what must be done." As the herb's effects continued to work through his system, Marcus found his awareness expanding beyond the immediate grove, to encompass the entire valley. He could sense the network of relationships that connected all living things, Cherokee and white settlers, animals and plants, land and water. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that the conflict between the two human communities was disrupting a larger harmony that affected everything in the region. Crawford sees only separation, Atsila explained, apparently following his thoughts. Cherokee versus white, civilized versus savage, his people versus everyone else. But the truth is connection. We are all part of the same web of life, and damage to any part weakens the whole. She stood and moved to a wooden chest that sat in the shadows beyond the firelight, returning with several objects that she placed on the mat between them. There was a medicine bag made from soft leather and decorated with beadwork, a knife with a bone handle carved with Cherokee symbols, and a small wooden flute that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "These are gifts," Atsila said, "but they are also responsibilities." The medicine bag contains herbs and preparations that can help with healing, both physical ailments and spiritual imbalances. The knife is for protection, but it should be used only when all other options have been exhausted. The flute? She paused, handling the instrument with obvious reverence. "The flute has been in my family for 7 generations. It has the power to call spirits, to communicate across great distances, and to calm hostile intentions." Marcus stared at the objects, understanding that accepting them would represent a formal commitment to something much larger than his own personal concerns. "I'm honored by your trust," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm worthy of such gifts." "Worthiness is not determined by perfection," Atsila replied. "It's determined by willingness to act with courage and compassion when the need arises. You have already demonstrated both qualities." As Marcus reached for the medicine bag, Atsila caught his wrist gently. "There is one more thing you must understand," she said seriously. "Accepting these gifts will change you. You will begin to see and hear things that other white men cannot perceive. You will become a bridge between worlds, which means you will fully belong to neither." The warning was sobering, but Marcus found that he was not deterred by it. His old life, the isolated existence of a grieving widower focused only on his own survival, no longer held any appeal. If he was going to live rather than merely exist, he needed to be part of something meaningful. "I accept the gifts," he said formally, "and the responsibilities that come with them." Atsila smiled for the first time since their meeting began. "Then let us begin your education. There are things you must learn about Cherokee ways, about the spiritual forces that influence human events, and about the specific challenges you will face in the coming months." What followed was the most intensive learning experience of Marcus's life. Over the course of 4 hours, Atsila taught him basic Cherokee phrases, showed him how to use the contents of the medicine bag, and explained the complex spiritual framework that governed Cherokee approaches to conflict resolution. Most importantly, she helped him understand the true nature of his relationship with Ayanna. "You saved her body that night when Crawford's mob came hunting," Atsila explained, "but she is meant to save your spirit. Together, you will become healers, not just of individual ailments, but of the divisions between your peoples." As dawn approached, Atsila began to prepare for their departure, but she had one final piece of instruction for Marcus. "Crawford will not accept the failure of his first attack quietly," she warned. "He will return with greater force and better planning. When he does, you must be ready to do more than simply defend against his assault." "What do you mean?" "I mean that survival requires more than just fighting off attacks. It requires changing the conditions that make attacks possible in the first place. Crawford's power comes from fear and division among the white settlers. To defeat him, you must give them something else to believe in." Marcus thought about this as Ayanna led him back through the forest toward his ranch. The old woman's words had given him much to consider, but they had also provided him with a sense of direction he hadn't possessed since Sarah's death. When they reached the edge of Marcus's property, Ayanna turned to him with an expression that was both hopeful and apprehensive. "How do you feel about what my grandmother shared with you?" "Overwhelmed," Marcus admitted, "but also more certain than I've been in years about what I need to do." "And what is that?" Marcus looked across his land with new eyes, seeing not just his own property, but part of a larger landscape that needed healing. "I need to become the kind of man who can help build peace instead of just preventing war. I need to learn everything you and your grandmother can teach me about working with natural forces instead of against them. And I need to find ways to show other settlers that their futures are connected to Cherokee futures, whether they realize it or not." Ayanna's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Then your real education begins now," she said. "And I think you're going to discover that healing a divided valley is more challenging and more rewarding than anything you've ever attempted." As Marcus watched her disappear into the forest, he understood that his life had just taken another decisive turn. He was no longer just a man who had helped some Cherokee people in a moment of crisis. He was now officially committed to a path that would require him to become someone entirely different from the grieving recluse he had been just a week ago. The question was whether he would prove equal to the challenges that lay ahead. The first test of Marcus's new role as a bridge builder came just 2 weeks after his meeting with Atsila, when Rebecca Morrison arrived at his ranch in a state of near panic. Rebecca was the wife of the tavern owner in Millbrook, a practical woman in her 40s who had never shown much interest in the political tensions surrounding the Cherokee situation. Her unexpected visit, particularly in such obvious distress, immediately put Marcus on alert. "Mr. Thompson," she said as she dismounted from her horse with trembling hands, "I need your help with something I don't know how to handle. It's about my youngest boy, Timothy." Marcus invited her inside and prepared coffee while Rebecca gathered herself enough to explain the crisis that had brought her to his door. Timothy Morrison was 8 years old, the youngest of Rebecca's 4 children, and the one she described as different from the others in ways that had always worried her. "He sees things," Rebecca said quietly, as if afraid that speaking the words too loudly might make them more real. "Animals that aren't there. People who died years ago. Events that happened before he was born. At first, we thought it was just a child's imagination, but lately—" She paused, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth from more than just the liquid. "Lately, what he's been seeing has been coming true." The week before, Timothy had awakened from a nightmare crying about a fire at the Hendersons' barn. He had described the flames in vivid detail, had even drawn pictures of how the fire would start and spread. 2 days later, the Henderson barn had burned down in exactly the manner Timothy had predicted, down to the specific animals that would be saved and which equipment would be lost. "Dr. Williams says there's nothing medically wrong with the boy," Rebecca continued, "but some of the townspeople are starting to whisper about witchcraft and unnatural influences. William Crawford has been asking pointed questions about whether Timothy might have Cherokee blood, suggesting that his ABILITIEs come from savage influences that need to be purged." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Crawford was apparently expanding his campaign beyond direct attacks on the Cherokee to include anyone in the white community who displayed characteristics he considered threatening or unnatural. An 8-year-old boy with prophetic dreams was exactly the kind of target that would allow Crawford to spread his message of fear and division among families who had previously considered themselves safe from his attention. "What exactly is Crawford suggesting?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He's saying that Timothy's visions are evidence of spiritual corruption, that somehow Cherokee witchcraft has infected our community. He's calling for the boy to be examined by a church committee, and he's hinting that if unnatural influences are found, they'll need to be removed by whatever means necessary." The threat was clear enough. Crawford was preparing to use a child's unusual gifts as justification for escalating his campaign against Cherokee spiritual practices, while simultaneously terrorizing white families who didn't conform to his narrow vision of acceptable behavior. "Where is Timothy now?" Marcus asked. "At home with my husband, but they're both terrified. William isn't a brave man, Mr. Thompson, and Crawford's been pressuring him to cooperate with the investigation. I'm afraid my husband might give in to save the tavern business." Marcus considered his options carefully. This was exactly the kind of situation Atzilla had prepared him for, a crisis that required him to act as a bridge between communities, using Cherokee wisdom to help a white family while simultaneously demonstrating that Cherokee spiritual practices were healing rather than threatening. "I might be able to help Timothy," Marcus said slowly, "but it would require me to use methods that Crawford would definitely consider unacceptable. Are you prepared for that?" Rebecca looked at him with desperate hope. "Mr. Thompson, if you can help my son understand and control what's happening to him, I don't care what methods you use. I just want my boy to be safe." That afternoon, Marcus rode into Millbrook with Rebecca, carrying Atzilla's medicine bag and prepared to openly demonstrate Cherokee healing practices in the heart of Crawford's territory. It was a calculated risk that could either establish his credibility as a healer or provide Crawford with the evidence he needed to brand Marcus as a Cherokee sympathizer who was corrupting good Christian families. The Morrison Tavern occupied the center of Millbrook's Main Street, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the entire town on him as he dismounted and followed Rebecca inside. Word of Timothy's visions had apparently spread throughout the community, and people were watching to see how the situation would be resolved. Timothy Morrison was a slight boy with enormous dark eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge for someone his age. When Marcus knelt down to speak with him, the child immediately grabbed his hand with an intensity that was startling. "You have the Cherokee medicine," Timothy said quietly, his voice carrying the same otherworldly quality that Marcus had noticed in Atzilla's speech. "The lady with silver hair told me you would come to help." Marcus felt a chill. "What lady with silver hair, Timothy?" "She comes to me in dreams sometimes. She teaches me things about the visions, about how to not be afraid of them. She said, you would know how to make the scary parts go away." Rebecca stared at her son in amazement. "Timothy, you never told me about any lady. Who is she?" Before the boy could answer, Marcus understood. Somehow, Atzilla had been reaching out to Timothy through the spiritual realm, preparing him for this meeting and providing comfort during his frightening experiences. The connection demonstrated just how far Cherokee spiritual practices extended beyond the physical world. "Timothy," Marcus said gently, "would you like me to teach you how to control your visions instead of being controlled by them?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Marcus began to apply the techniques Atzilla had taught him. Using a combination of Cherokee meditation practices and herbal preparations from his medicine bag, he helped Timothy learn to enter a calm state where he could experience his visions without being overwhelmed by them. The process took several hours and drew a crowd of curious townspeople who gathered outside the tavern to observe this unprecedented display of Cherokee healing methods being used on a white child. Marcus was acutely aware that his every action was being scrutinized and judged, but he focused entirely on helping Timothy develop the skills he needed to manage his unusual gifts. The breakthrough came when Timothy successfully had a controlled vision and was able to describe what he saw without fear or distress. He spoke of a coming storm that would bring flooding to the lower part of town, and gave specific guidance about which buildings would be affected and how people could prepare for the damage. More importantly, Timothy's entire demeanor changed during the healing process. Where he had been frightened and withdrawn, he became calm and confident, understanding for the first time that his visions were a gift rather than a curse. "How do you feel now?" Marcus asked as the session concluded. "Like I can see clearly instead of through smoke," Timothy replied with a mature wisdom that startled everyone present. The scary parts weren't real. They were just my fear making the vision seem dangerous when they were actually trying to help. Rebecca Morrison burst into tears of relief and gratitude. Her son had been transformed from a terrified child into someone who understood and accepted his unusual abilities. More importantly, the healing had been accomplished through methods that were obviously beneficial rather than harmful, making it difficult for even Crawford's supporters to argue that Cherokee spiritual practices were inherently dangerous. But Marcus knew that Crawford would not simply accept this demonstration of Cherokee healing's effectiveness. If anything, Timothy's successful treatment would be seen as evidence that Cherokee influences were spreading into white families, requiring even more aggressive action to prevent further contamination. The confrontation Marcus had been expecting came 3 days later, when Crawford arrived at the Morrison Tavern with a delegation of church leaders and territorial officials. They demanded that Timothy be subjected to a formal examination to determine whether he had been corrupted by Cherokee witchcraft, and they insisted that any ongoing treatment follow approved Christian methods rather than savage practices. Marcus happened to be in town purchasing supplies when Crawford's delegation arrived, and he immediately recognized the situation as another test of his role as a bridge builder. This time, however, he wouldn't be acting alone. Over the past week, word of Timothy's successful healing had spread throughout the community, and Marcus had been approached by several other families who were dealing with problems they thought Cherokee methods might help address. There was Martha Stevens, whose infant daughter had been born with a twisted foot that conventional medicine couldn't correct. There was David Walsh, a blacksmith whose hands had been crippled by arthritis that was ending his ability to work. There was even Pastor John Miller, whose chronic headaches were becoming so severe that he could barely conduct church services. All of these people had heard about Timothy's transformation and had quietly asked Marcus whether Cherokee healing might be able to help them as well. More importantly, they had begun to see Cherokee spiritual practices not as threatening foreign influences, but as potentially valuable tools for addressing problems that their own medical and religious traditions couldn't solve. When Crawford's delegation confronted the Morrison family, Marcus stepped forward with an unexpected proposal. Instead of subjecting Timothy to an examination designed to find evidence of corruption, why not conduct a public demonstration of Cherokee healing methods that would allow the entire community to judge their effectiveness for themselves? If Cherokee medicine is as dangerous and unnatural as you claim, Marcus said to Crawford, then surely a public demonstration will make that obvious to everyone present. But if these methods actually help people solve real problems, then perhaps we should be learning from them rather than condemning them. The challenge put Crawford in a difficult position. Refusing to allow a public demonstration would make him appear afraid of having his claims tested, while agreeing to it would give Marcus a platform to showcase Cherokee healing's benefits in front of the entire community. Crawford's response revealed both his cunning and his limitations. He agreed to the demonstration, but demanded that it be conducted under controlled conditions with church and territorial officials serving as judges. Any healing that occurred through natural means would be credited to divine providence, while any results that couldn't be explained through conventional medicine would be considered evidence of dangerous supernatural influences. The terms were biased, but Marcus accepted them because he understood something Crawford didn't. Genuine healing speaks for itself, regardless of how observers choose to interpret it. When people see their children's suffering relieved, their own pain reduced, or their family's problems solved, they don't care about theological explanations or political implications. They care about results. The public demonstration was scheduled for the following Sunday after church services in the town square, where everyone in Millbrook could observe. Word spread quickly throughout the region, drawing people from neighboring settlements who were curious about this unprecedented test of Cherokee healing methods. As the day approached, Marcus found himself working closely with Ayanna to prepare for what would essentially be a public trial of everything Atsila had taught him. They practiced the healing techniques repeatedly, discussed how to explain Cherokee spiritual concepts to people who had no background in such ideas, and prepared for the skepticism and possible hostility they would face. "Are you nervous?" Ayanna asked as they made their final preparations. "Terrified," Marcus admitted, "but also excited. This is our chance to show people that Cherokee and white approaches to healing can work together instead of competing against each other." "And if we fail?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "If we fail, Crawford will have the justification he needs to escalate his campaign against your people. But if we succeed, we'll have taken the first step toward building the kind of understanding that makes peace possible." The stakes could not have been higher, but Marcus felt ready for the challenge. He had learned to trust in Cherokee wisdom, in his own developing abilities, and in the fundamental human desire for healing and wholeness that transcended cultural boundaries. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for what would become the most important day in Copper Valley's history. The town square of Millbrook had never hosted anything like the gathering that assembled on that bright Sunday afternoon in November 1847. Nearly 300 people had traveled from across the territory to witness what many were calling the Cherokee trial. Though Marcus preferred to think of it as an opportunity to demonstrate the healing power that could emerge when different traditions worked together rather than against each other, Crawford had spent the week organizing his own supporters, bringing in church leaders from neighboring counties and territorial officials who shared his views about the dangers of allowing Cherokee influences to spread among white communities. They had constructed a makeshift platform where the judges could observe the proceedings, and they had established strict rules about what would constitute acceptable versus unacceptable results. But Marcus had not been idle either, working with Joseph Ridge and other Cherokee leaders. He had arranged for a delegation of Cherokee healers to be present as observers and consultants. More importantly, he had spent the week treating additional patients in preparation for the public demonstration, building a growing body of evidence about the effectiveness of Cherokee healing methods. The crowd that gathered in the square represented every faction in the increasingly divided community. There were Crawford's hardcore supporters, easily identifiable by their hostile expressions and the weapons they carried openly despite the supposedly peaceful nature of the event. There were Cherokee families who had come to support Marcus and Ayanna, though they remained carefully separated from the white attendees. Most importantly, there was a large group of uncommitted settlers who had come to see for themselves whether Cherokee medicine was the dangerous witchcraft Crawford claimed or the beneficial healing practice Marcus insisted it could be. Timothy Morrison stood at the center of the square with his parents, serving as the primary evidence for both sides of the argument. Crawford's supporters pointed to the boy's unusual abilities as proof that he had been corrupted by supernatural influences that needed to be purged. Marcus's supporters saw Timothy's transformation from a frightened child to a confident young person as evidence that Cherokee methods could help rather than harm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford announced as he took his position on the platform, "we are gathered here today to determine whether the practices being promoted by Marcus Thompson represent legitimate healing or dangerous spiritual corruption. The stakes of this determination could not be higher. We are deciding whether to allow foreign influences to spread among our children, or whether to protect our community from forces that could destroy everything we've worked to build." The speech was classic Crawford, inflammatory rhetoric designed to frame the issue in terms of us versus them, rather than seeking common ground. But Marcus had learned from Atsila that the most effective way to counter such tactics was not through equally heated rhetoric, but through calm demonstration of positive results. "Mr. Crawford raises important concerns," Marcus replied when given his opportunity to address the crowd. "The safety and well-being of our children should indeed be our highest priority. That's exactly why I've been working to learn Cherokee healing methods. because they offer help for problems that our traditional approaches haven't been able to solve. Marcus gestured toward Timothy Morrison. This young man was suffering from visions that terrified him and disrupted his entire family's life. Conventional medicine had no answers for his condition. Cherokee healing methods not only relieved his suffering but helped him understand that his unusual gifts could be used to help his community rather than burden it. Now, Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the square, rather than arguing about theories and possibilities, let me show you what Cherokee healing can actually accomplish. What followed was the most remarkable display of healing that anyone in the territory had ever witnessed. Working with Ayanna and using the techniques that Sila had taught him, Marcus treated a series of patients whose conditions had been well documented by local medical authorities. The first case was Martha Stevens's infant daughter, Emma, who had been born with a severely twisted foot that Dr. Williams had declared uncorrectable without amputation. Using a combination of Cherokee massage techniques and herbal preparations, Marcus and Ayanna worked on the child's foot for nearly an hour while hundreds of people watched in absolute silence. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. As they worked, the twisted bones and tendons began to realign themselves. The swelling reduced, and the foot assumed an increasingly normal appearance. By the time they finished, baby Emma's foot was completely normal, and she was able to move her toes and ankle with full range of motion. The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Martha Stevens broke down in tears of joy and gratitude, while Dr. Williams examined the child's foot with obvious amazement and confirmed that the deformity had been completely corrected. "How is this possible?" Dr. Williams asked Marcus directly. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of medical practice. Cherokee medicine teaches us to work with the body's natural healing abilities rather than against them," Marcus explained. "Every living thing has an innate capacity for wholeness. Sometimes it just needs the right kind of encouragement to express itself." Crawford's supporters tried to dismiss the healing as either fraud or dangerous supernatural manipulation. But their arguments became increasingly weak as Marcus and Ayanna treated patient after patient with consistently positive results. David Walsh, the blacksmith whose arthritis had crippled his hands, regained full flexibility and strength after a treatment that combined Cherokee meditation techniques with specific herbal preparations. Pastor John Miller's chronic headaches disappeared completely after Ayanna identified and corrected spiritual imbalances that conventional medicine had never addressed. Most dramatically, an elderly Cherokee man named Robert Foreman, who had been blind for 3 years following an accident, had his sight partially restored through techniques that seemed to work on levels far deeper than mere physical healing. With each successful treatment, the crowd's mood shifted dramatically. People who had arrived expecting to witness dangerous witchcraft instead saw neighbors and family members receiving help for problems that had seemed hopeless. The Cherokee healers were clearly working to relieve suffering rather than cause it, and their methods produced results that spoke for themselves. But the real breakthrough came when Crawford himself suffered an unexpected crisis that forced him to confront the limitations of his own worldview. During the afternoon's demonstrations, Crawford had been growing increasingly agitated as he watched his carefully constructed narrative about Cherokee dangers collapsing in the face of obvious healing successes. His face had grown redder with each patient Marcus and Ayanna treated, and his voice had become more strident as he tried to maintain his supporters' attention. Suddenly, in the middle of one of his speeches denouncing Cherokee spiritual practices as satanic deceptions, Crawford collapsed, clutching his chest. The symptoms were unmistakable. He was having a heart attack, brought on by the stress and rage that had been consuming him for months. Dr. Williams rushed to Crawford's aid, but quickly realized that his conventional medical tools were inadequate for the crisis. Crawford was dying, and there was nothing traditional medicine could do to save him in the middle of a town square with no hospital or advanced equipment available. Please, Crawford's wife Sarah begged Marcus through her tears. I don't care about the politics or the arguments. Can you help him? The moment represented the ultimate test of everything Marcus had learned about Cherokee healing philosophy. Atsila had taught him that true healing recognized no boundaries between friend and enemy, that the forces of life and wholeness were available to anyone who needed them, regardless of their beliefs or actions. Marcus knelt beside Crawford without hesitation, placing his hands on the man's chest and reaching for the deepest levels of Cherokee healing knowledge that Atsila had shared with him. Working with Ayanna, he began to address not just Crawford's physical crisis, but the spiritual imbalances that had created it. The healing that followed was unlike anything Marcus had attempted before. As he worked to restore Crawford's heart function, he also found himself addressing the fear, anger, and hatred that had been poisoning Crawford's spirit for years. It was as if the heart attack had been the inevitable result of carrying too much toxic emotion for too long. The process took nearly 2 hours, with the entire crowd maintaining absolute silence as they watched Marcus fight to save the life of the man who had been trying to destroy him. When Crawford finally opened his eyes and took a deep, steady breath, the sound that rose from the assembled crowd was like a collective exhale of relief and wonder. How do you feel? Dr. Williams asked as he examined Crawford's vital signs. Like I've been carrying a weight I didn't know was there, and someone finally helped me put it down, Crawford replied weakly but clearly. He looked up at Marcus with an expression that was completely different from the hatred that had defined their previous interactions. You saved my life. After everything I've done to hurt you and your Cherokee friends, you still saved my life. That's what healers do, Marcus replied simply. We help whoever needs help, regardless of the circumstances. Crawford struggled to sit up, his wife supporting him as he addressed the crowd. I owe all of you an apology, he said, his voice carrying across the square. I've been so focused on my fears about change and loss of control that I couldn't see the good in what Mr. Thompson and the Cherokee healers were offering. Today I learned that healing is always good, no matter where it comes from or who provides it. The transformation in Crawford was as dramatic as any of the physical healings that had occurred that day. The man who had spent months spreading fear and hatred had become an advocate for understanding and cooperation. His public endorsement of Cherokee healing methods carried enormous weight with settlers who had been influenced by his previous rhetoric, but perhaps more importantly, Crawford's healing demonstrated the deepest truth of Cherokee medicine, that spiritual wholeness and physical health were inseparable, and that true healing required addressing the root causes of imbalance rather than just treating symptoms. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, the crowd dispersed with a completely different understanding of the relationship between Cherokee and white communities. What had begun as a trial to determine whether Cherokee practices were dangerous had become a demonstration that healing knew no cultural boundaries. What happens now? Ayanna asked Marcus as they packed up their healing supplies. Now we build on what we've started here, Marcus replied. Today showed people that Cherokee and white healing traditions can work together to help everyone. Tomorrow we start the real work of creating a community where that cooperation becomes normal instead of extraordinary. The healing in the square had been a victory, but Marcus understood that it was only the beginning. Crawford's conversion would help, but there would be other opponents, other challenges, other tests of whether two very different peoples could find ways to support each other rather than competing for dominance. As he looked across the square, where Cherokee and white families were talking together for the first time in months, Marcus felt hopeful about the future. The foundation for lasting peace had been laid through this simple act of people helping other people heal. Now it was time to build something lasting on that foundation. 6 months after the healing demonstration in Millbrook's town square, Marcus Thompson stood on the porch of what had once been his solitary ranch house, watching the sun rise over a valley that had been transformed beyond recognition. The morning brought with it the sounds of a thriving community. Children's laughter from the school that had been built on the border between Cherokee and white settlements. The rhythmic hammering from workshops where Cherokee and white craftsmen worked side by side. And the gentle murmur of conversations in both English and Cherokee from the trading post that had become the valley's new social center. But the change that filled Marcus with the deepest satisfaction was much more personal. Ayanna emerged from the house carrying their newborn son, a child who would grow up in a world where Cherokee and white traditions were woven together rather than kept in rigid separation. They had married 3 months earlier in a ceremony that combined Cherokee spiritual rituals with Christian traditions, officiated jointly by Pastor Miller and Joseph Ridge, in what many considered the symbolic culmination of the valley's transformation. "He's going to be hungry soon," Ayanna said softly, settling into the chair beside Marcus with the infant cradled against her chest. "But he seems to like watching the sunrise as much as his father does." Marcus smiled, reaching over to gently touch his son's tiny hand. They had named him Benjamin Samuel Thompson Blackbird, honoring both Marcus's lost son and the Cherokee man who had become like a brother to him. The hyphenated surname had been Marcus's idea, a way of ensuring that their child would carry both his Cherokee and white heritage with equal pride. "What are you thinking about?" Ayanna asked, noting the contemplative expression on her husband's face. "How different everything is from what I expected when I first came to this valley," Marcus replied. "I thought I was looking for isolation and solitude. Instead, I found a purpose I never knew I was meant to serve." The transformation of Copper Valley had indeed been remarkable, but it hadn't happened without challenges and setbacks. Crawford's conversion after his healing had eliminated the most vocal opposition to Cherokee white cooperation, but it had also created new complexities as the former antagonist threw himself into promoting integration with the same intensity he had once devoted to preventing it. The real work had begun in the weeks following the public demonstration, when Marcus and Ayanna started the practical task of building institutions that could support genuine cooperation between the two communities. The Cherokee Healing Center that they established attracted patients from across the territory, while the agricultural innovations that resulted from combining Cherokee land management techniques with white farming methods produced crop yields that amazed everyone involved. But perhaps the most significant development had been the school that educated Cherokee and white children together, teaching both traditional Cherokee knowledge and conventional academic subjects. Timothy Morrison, now 9 years old and completely comfortable with his prophetic abilities, had become one of the school's most effective teachers, helping other children understand that being different could be a gift, rather than a burden. The integration hadn't been without its critics. Federal territorial authorities had initially been suspicious of the Cherokee white cooperation, fearing that it might represent some form of Cherokee political organizing that could threaten territorial control. A series of investigations had been conducted, but these had ultimately concluded that the Copper Valley experiment was producing exactly the kind of peaceful, productive community that territorial policy was designed to encourage. More challenging had been the opposition from some Cherokee traditionalists who worried that too much integration with white culture would result in the loss of essential Cherokee identity and spiritual practices. These concerns had required careful navigation, with Atsila playing a crucial role in helping her people understand that sharing their wisdom didn't require abandoning their traditions. "Your grandmother was right about almost everything," Marcus told Ayanna as they watched their son begin to stir with the approach of feeding time. "The spirits did know what was coming, and they did prepare us for the roles we needed to play." Atsila, now in her 70s but still the most respected spiritual leader in the Cherokee community, had become Marcus's closest advisor and teacher. Under her guidance, he had developed healing abilities that went far beyond anything he had imagined possible during that first desperate night when he rode to warn the Cherokee of Crawford's approaching mob. "She was wrong about one thing, though," Ayanna said with a smile. She told you that becoming a bridge between worlds would mean you wouldn't fully belong to either. But look around you, you belong here more completely than most people belong. Anywhere. Marcus considered this observation as he surveyed the community that had grown up around them. She was right, of course. Rather than leaving him isolated between two worlds, his role as a bridge builder had connected him more deeply to both Cherokee and white communities than he had ever been connected to anything in his previous life. Sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road that led to their property. A small delegation was riding toward them. Joseph Ridge, Samuel Ridge, William Crawford, and Dr. Williams, along with several other men Marcus recognized as leaders from both communities. "They're early," Ayanna observed, shifting the baby to her other arm. "The territorial commissioner isn't supposed to arrive until this afternoon." The delegation that was approaching represented the Copper Valley Council, a governing body that had evolved to manage the increasingly complex affairs of the integrated community. Today's meeting would be particularly significant because they were hosting a visit from Territorial Commissioner James Patterson, who was conducting an official review of the Cherokee White Cooperation Experiment with an eye toward potentially recommending it as a model for other regions. "Marcus, Ayanna," Joseph Ridge called as the group dismounted. "We need to discuss the presentation we're making to Commissioner Patterson. There are some new developments that could affect how he views our situation." The men gathered on Marcus's porch represented something that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Cherokee and white leaders working together as equals to address shared challenges. Crawford, in particular, had become one of the most effective advocates for the integrated community model, using his political connections to promote the Copper Valley experiment to territorial and federal authorities. "What kind of developments?" Marcus asked as Ayanna excused herself to feed the baby. "Both positive and concerning," Dr. Williams replied. "The positive news is that our medical outcomes have attracted attention from medical colleges back east. They're sending representatives to study our integrated healing methods with an eye toward incorporating Cherokee techniques into formal medical education." "And the concerning news?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. "There are rumors that some of the Cherokee communities in other parts of the territory are being pressured to relocate further west," Samuel Ridge said grimly. "The discovery of additional gold deposits has renewed interest in clearing Cherokee lands for white settlement." The news struck Marcus like a physical blow. Despite all their success in Copper Valley, the larger forces that drove conflict between Cherokee and white communities remained active throughout the territory. Their isolated experiment in cooperation existed within a broader context of ongoing displacement and violence. "What does this mean for us?" Crawford asked. "Could federal authorities decide that our arrangement is too politically sensitive to continue?" "That's exactly what we need to discuss with Commissioner Patterson," Joseph Ridge replied. "We need to convince him that what we've built here represents a solution to Cherokee white conflicts, not a complication that adds to them." As they talked, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a broken man consumed by grief and isolated from human connection. The decision to help Ayanna that night had set in motion a chain of events that had not only healed his own spirit, but had created a model for how different peoples could work together rather than against each other. Commissioner Patterson arrived that afternoon with a substantial entourage of territorial officials and federal representatives. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and the kind of careful, evaluating expression that Marcus associated with career bureaucrats who had learned to be skeptical of anything that deviated from established procedures. The presentation that the Copper Valley Council made to Commissioner Patterson was comprehensive and carefully planned. They showed him the school where Cherokee and white children learned together, the medical center where traditional Cherokee healing methods were being documented and taught to white physicians, and the agricultural experiments that were producing unprecedented crop yields through the integration of different farming techniques, but the most powerful part of the presentation was unplanned. As they toured the community, Commissioner Patterson had the opportunity to observe dozens of spontaneous interactions between Cherokee and white families who had clearly moved beyond mere tolerance to genuine friendship and mutual respect. In my 20 years of territorial administration, Patterson told the assembled council at the end of his visit, I have never seen anything like what you have accomplished here. You have proven that Cherokee and white communities can not only coexist peacefully, but can actually thrive through cooperation. He paused, looking around at the mixed group of Cherokee and white leaders who had organized his visit. The question is whether this model can be replicated in other locations, or whether it requires the specific combination of circumstances and personalities that exist here in Copper Valley. With respect, Commissioner, Marcus said, I don't think what we've accomplished here is unique to our particular circumstances. I think it's the natural result of people choosing to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies, and of having leadership that's committed to finding solutions rather than perpetuating conflicts. You may be right, Patterson replied thoughtfully. But implementing this approach on a larger scale would require significant changes in federal Indian policy, changes that would face substantial political opposition from interests that profit from conflict and displacement. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, covering everything from the practical mechanics of integrated governance to the broader, philosophical questions about how different cultures could maintain their distinctiveness while still cooperating effectively. As the meeting concluded, Commissioner Patterson made a commitment that would prove to be the most important outcome of his visit. He agreed to write a formal report recommending that the Copper Valley model be studied and potentially replicated in other regions where Cherokee white conflicts were ongoing. I can't guarantee that my recommendations will be implemented, he told Marcus and the other council members, but I can guarantee that your example will be documented and shared with other territorial administrators who are looking for alternatives to the current cycle of conflict and displacement. That evening, as the visitors departed and the community settled into its normal rhythm, Marcus and Ayanna sat on their porch with their son, watching the stars emerge in the clear autumn sky. Do you think it will work? Ayanna asked. Can what we've built here really become a model for other places? I don't know, Marcus replied honestly. But I know that we've proven it's possible for people to choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear. That proof exists now, and it can't be taken away regardless of what political decisions are made by people in distant capitals. He looked down at his sleeping son, thinking about the world the child would grow up in. Benjamin will live in a place where Cherokee and white traditions are both valued and preserved. He'll learn that being different from other people doesn't make you enemies, it makes you potential teachers for each other. And if other communities follow our example, he might live in a world where that understanding extends far beyond Copper Valley. As if responding to his parents' conversation, Benjamin stirred slightly and made the soft sounds that indicated he was dreaming. Marcus wondered what visions might be visiting his son's sleep, what possibilities the child might be seeing that were still invisible to adult eyes. The story that had begun with Marcus racing through the darkness to save a Cherokee woman from a Lynch mob had evolved into something far larger than either of them could have imagined. They had not only found love and healing for themselves, but had created a community that proved different peoples could build something together that was stronger and more beautiful than anything either could achieve alone. The morning that would dawn over Copper Valley in a few hours would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be political pressures to navigate, cultural traditions to preserve and adapt, and the ongoing work of building understanding between communities that had been taught to fear each other. But as Marcus Thompson held his wife and son, while the night settled around their integrated community, he felt confident that whatever the future brought, they would face it together. The foundation they had built was solid enough to support whatever structures needed to be erected upon it. The Cherokee woman he had protected from a lynch mob had indeed seen his heart like no one ever had. More importantly, she had helped him discover parts of himself he hadn't known existed, and together they had created a legacy that would endure long after their own story had become part of the valley's history. In the end, it hadn't been about sight or blindness, Cherokee or white, traditional or modern. It had been about choosing love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and cooperation over conflict. Those choices, made one person and one moment at a time, had transformed not just their own lives, but an entire community. And in a world that often seemed determined to emphasize what divided people rather than what connected them, that transformation represented a kind of miracle, proof that healing, like love, recognized no boundaries and could flourish anywhere people were willing to choose hope over despair. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Marcus Thompson slept peacefully beside his Cherokee wife, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of building the kind of world their son deserved to inherit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.